and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today we welcome Cody Poulton, who recently retired from the University of Victoria in Canada, where he taught Japanese literature, theater, and culture for over 30 years. He's also a translator of Japanese fiction and drama. Cody is author of Spirits of Another Sort, the plays of Izumi Kyoto, A Beggar's Art, Scripting Modernity in Japan, and he co-edited the Columbia Anthology of Modern Japanese Drama. I was fortunate enough to be able to meet up with Cody here when he was visiting Shiraishi Island. Since it was a great opportunity to do a face-to-face interview, I abandoned our normal digital recording format. Instead, we sat down at the low tea table next to the Japanese garden in my house and talked about Japanese theater. I might add that it was also softly raining, which you'll surely be able to hear in the background. I apologize for the moments where we sacrificed audio quality in order to have a more organic in-person conversation. So, welcome, Cody.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
He's right here in front of me. He's come to Shiraishi Island to visit. We've had a wonderful couple days, haven't we?
We have. It's been delightful.
Today, Cody's going to talk to us about Japanese performing arts, and in particular, No. But I was wondering if we could start off with a general introduction about the differences between the different performing arts, Kabuki No and...
Okay, one of the things that's so interesting about Japan, and not just in the performing arts, but in the arts in general, in terms of the artistic culture, the spiritual culture, the very new lies on strata upon strata of the very old. So we can go back to very primitive, very early stuff, very elemental stuff, primal stuff, like Shinto rituals and things like that. And on top of that is overlaid other arts, performance arts, and things like that. So we have some of the oldest continuing performance traditions in the world here in Japan.
And how far back do they go?
Well, the No goes back at least 600 years to Zeami and Kannami, but those guys were, the father and son, were already within a performance tradition that had existed for maybe 200-300 years prior to them. And things have changed since then. All sorts of things have changed since then. But we have the texts, we have the music, the basic choreography, which has been handed down in a continuous tradition. In the case of Kabuki, the tradition is 400 years from Izumo no Okuni, the woman who started it around 600 AD, around the time of Shakespeare. And again, a continuous performance tradition taught by usually father to son from generation upon generation. In the Bundaku, somewhat a similar thing because that's contemporaneous to the Kabuki, but also draws upon much older performance tradition of folk puppetry from all over Japan. That's extraordinary. We don't have that in Europe, for example. We talk about Greek tragedy or Shakespeare for that matter, and we have the texts, but we really don't know that much about how they were performed exactly, because the performance traditions have been more or less reinvented with every generation, or certainly every century or so.
Do you think part of that is because in Japan they tend to hand down the tradition to the son and to the next and the next, so it maybe keeps those old traditions going in the same way? Or does each generation still innovate?
Every generation innovates, but they innovate within a vessel which has been given to them. So there is a continuity and variation within the continuity. But the performance tradition of handing down an art form from one generation to the next is extremely important for the Japanese. Obviously, some performance traditions have been lost, particularly in the last 50 years or so. Some are on their way out and have already become museum pieces. But for the most part, Japan has been remarkably resilient and conservative in a good way in maintaining these traditions.
I've read quite a few No plays, and I've seen one live performance, which was when I first came to Japan, and it was outside, kind of like Kagura is performed outside. And I had no idea what was going on, but it was so exciting to me because of the costumes and the voice and the music. Could you explain a little bit the difference between reading a play and seeing it performed live?
I first came to know through texts and read the plays and thought they were very beautiful in the same way that, say, somebody like William Butler Yeats or Ezra Pound read these plays, or Arthur Waley, for that matter, who probably never saw no performance himself. Waley never went to Japan, never went to Asia, period.
Oh, really?
You know, his access to Chinese and Japanese literature was through texts, almost totally through texts.
Oh, he's a great translator.
Amazing what he was able to accomplish. But anyway, so for me, same thing, my access to know was through the text. And then when I first saw the play, I thought, huh? There was this huge disjunct between the text and the performance. First of all, of course, the performance was in Japanese, and it's classical Japanese, a Japanese dating from, say, 15th century text. That is harder for Japanese to understand than it would be for us to understand Chaucer, for example. It's just in another language that most people don't understand. And the way it's sung and behind the mass, the voices are distorted, so most people wouldn't understand what was going on. And then the texts are short and the performance is long. You have a few pages of text, maybe 6 pages or less than 10 pages of text, but the performance goes on for 60 minutes or 90 minutes or sometimes even 2 hours. So what the hell's going on there? Well, the text is not the whole performance, and the text is not the performance. The performance is the singing of the text. It is the music that accompanies that, the movement, primarily dance, which is extraordinarily slow. The interesting thing about No was that it's probably doubled in length. Performance time of plays has doubled in length since the Middle Ages, when these plays were written and performed by people like Kanami and Zeami, the father and son, who really sort of created and elevated the art. So we know that from texts and programs that, you know, a play like Hagoromo or Yamamba, for example, would have been performed in half the time it is now. So what gives there? Why has it become so slow? One major reason is that in the Tokugawa period, from 1600 on or so, the Tokugawa shogunate elevated No into a kind of a court ceremonial of the samurai aristocracy. And they slowed everything down. It's like gagaku, which is slow. But the original Chinese models for gagaku, probably if we sped up the tunes of gagaku and dances, it would be more like what the Chinese was. So everything has become slower.
Gagaku is the music,
Yeah.
right? And can you go into a little bit more about what, I mean, it wouldn't be the kind of music that a Western person would expect.
No, well, gagaku is music that came from Tang China, but some of it came from Korea, some of it came from Vietnam, some of it came from maybe as far away as Persia. It's the Asian court music that came to Japan in the Nara period. Some of that feeds its way into the No music. The No music is essentially 2 or 3 drums and a flute and a chorus. Now, unlike the Greek chorus, they don't dance, they sit and they sing and they do parts, and sometimes they speak for the protagonist, the shomyo from Buddhist chant, and various different, the shite as it's called. And it's a form of chanting. Some of it comes from melodic forms of popular music of the Middle Ages in Japan. But it's not like Western music at all. The first experience, I'm sure you can agree, when you go to see the No play is there's the shriek of the flute, there's the crack of the drum, and then there's all this howling going on. Yo! Ah! just sort of very strange and unearthly. And I think some of the strangeness and unearthliness there, well, it is intentional. It's supposed to take us into a different kind of time and space. And in terms of the subject matter of plays, a lot of the plays are about the other world. They're about ghosts, they're gods, they're demons, they're spirits of plants and trees and so on. It's not an anthropocentric universe at all in the No. So we are carried to another space in the No. The other thing is that for most people who go to see the No, they will nod off in fairly short order. My wife used to, within 10 seconds of the beginning of a No play, she would just kind of crash. And then she would wake up at the end after a couple of hours and say what a nice sleep she had had. So
is that because it's so hypnotic or because it's so slow?
Well, it's both. I think the slowness there is to induce a kind of a hypnotic state, a kind of an altered state of consciousness, if you will, where we are sort of between waking reality and dreams. And a lot of the plays, the so-called Fukushiki Mugen no, the phantasmal No two-part structure, you know, a guy meets, usually a guy, a priest or a courtier, goes to a place, visits the place that's famous in Japanese poetry or history or something happened there, and meets a villager. The villager tells them the story about why the place is famous and says, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed, I'm actually the ghost," and then disappears. And then the villager reappears in his or her real form in the second part, in a dream of the priest or monk he's lying there and he's sleeping, and the ghost appears to him in his dream. And so we are taken into that dream consciousness of the story itself.
So doesn't that transformation kind of happen in Yamamba?
Yes. Okay. In Yamamba, which is the mountain crone, I think that's one translation for the play, there is a woman who's a popular dancer who's taken on the name Hyakuman Yamamba, million crone, okay, mountain crone. And she's popular for her dances in the city, and she's heard that there's a real Yamamba in the mountains, and so she goes to this place. And the real Yamamba appears and says, "Well, you're just kind of a poor imitation of the real me, and let me show you how to dance." And the Yamamba, the true Yamamba, is a kind of a manifestation of the mountain and all of the natural forces and the wildness of nature, which she expresses in her dance. So it just kind of blows away the imitation human Yamamba. And it's a long play. It's about 90 minutes long. It's a very strong character. It's probably one of the great plays in the known repertoire for sure. The mask is beautiful. This is one of the things about the No masks, are their extraordinary works of art. She's wearing this great shaggy wig of hair. You know, that there is a style for young people of dyeing their hair gray, and they call it the Yamamba look.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah. And she's age itself, but she's the power and wisdom and magnificence of old age and the identification with the mountain and nature itself, natural forces. So it's this encounter again, which is the sort of the kind of narrative of all No plays, the encounter of mortality with immortality, with limited understanding of the human being, with the infinitude of nature itself and supernature. So it's a great play that way, and the dance is great, and again, it's extremely slow and ponderous in its own way, but I've had this experience with the No. You go to see these plays and you sort of go into a trance, and then suddenly the flute shrieks or there's a crack of a drum and you kind of wake up. The first time I saw a play, I can't remember what was it, Kasuga Ryujin, I think. And this was in Nagoya, very first play I saw. I fell asleep and I was woken up by the drum and the flute, and I looked up and the actor was suspended in midair. like floating
Wow.
there.
Yeah.
And that would, it was mind-blowing. I said, okay, there's something going on with this theater, that they could create that kind of experience. And they know how to wake you, as it were, to this kind of supernatural experience. Another experience I had with Funabenke, which is a demon play. The ghost of Taira no Tomomori rises out of the waves and comes back at Yoshitsune and Benkei. They're on the boat. And when the ghost came down stage, I was sitting stage front center, and the ghost came down with a big halberd and again with this big shaggy wig. And I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, It's also very visceral. And those are the kinds of things you can only feel in performance. You don't get that necessarily from the text, but it's all the other things that go with the text in performance that create those kinds of moments.
I would really love to see a performance of Hagoromo with the feathered cloak. Could you tell a little bit about that story?
Yeah. Hagoromo is based on a kind of a folkloric motif, which is almost universal. You can find it all over the world, of an encounter of a human being with a supernatural creature, an angel, call it what you will. In this story, the angel, the Tenyo, has come down to earth to bathe. And in order to bathe, she's taken off her cloak. And along comes a fisherman, finds this beautiful cloak hanging on a branch of a tree. And he snatches it, and she comes out naked. And she says, "Give me back my cloak. I can't fly back to heaven if I don't have it." And he said, "Well, why should I give it back to you?" And she said, "Well, if you give it back to me, I'll teach you a dance of the spirits, of the gods. And this will be an important dance for you, because this will be your connection with the divine." And they banter back and forth. "Well, how can you be sure that you're not going to cheat me if I give you back the cloak," and so on and so forth. And she says, "Well, humans are suspicious, but we divine creatures believe in faith and mutual understanding and so on." And so he gives back the cloak, and she does the dance. And he learns this dance and flies back to heaven. Now, this is a universal folkloric motif. I see this in the west coast of Canada, where I'm from, with the native people, the Coast Salish and the Kwakwak, the winter dances of those people, are all about receiving a song or a dance from the spirits. And often you have to go out in the forest and do various different kinds of ascetic rituals to receive that knowledge. But when you get it, you bring it back and you share that with the community, but that's your dance and that's your song. You got it from the gods. You didn't get it from other people. And that becomes, you got a copyright on that in a way, right? And so it is with Japan as well. There's a wonderful passage about Hagoromo that I want to just read. This is in Arthur Waley's The No Plays of Japan in the appendix. He's quoting an English couple that were in Japan early on the 20th century. And he writes here, "The best single moment I have seen was the dance of thanks to the fisherman who returns to the divine lady of the Hagoromo, the robe without which even an angel cannot fly. It seemed to me an example of the excellent rule in art that if a right thing is perhaps rather dull or monotonous, lasting 5 minutes, you will not cure the defect by cutting the performance to 2.5 minutes. Rather, give it 10 minutes. If it is still perhaps rather dull, try 20 minutes or an hour." And it goes on like that. But essentially, John Cage had to have read this, because John Cage said, if something's boring at 2 minutes, try 4. If it's still boring, try 8, and on and on and on. There is a kind of transcendental boredom to No. It is a slow dramaturgy. It's a slow theater. We have to slow down our consciousness in order to get into the space of No, because if we do and we let ourselves into that space of the performance, then time and space itself expands into infinity and eternity. And this is a way for us to contact those things. So I think this is, one of the great performance arts in the world. It does something that very few other performances do. Certainly you don't see this in European theater. I think certain contemporary forms of theater and music really would like to try to recreate that experience. But in No, they've been doing it for at least 600 years. It's a really finely honed art. And also, I think it's bottomless. The more I see it, the more I read about it, the more I study it, the more it kind of expands and becomes even more rich.
And even though No is so old, it actually does have applications in modern Japan. And I'm thinking of Takasago, and how the music or the words are still used in weddings to this day.
Right, yes. No has a liturgical purpose. It always had. It's kind of a kuyo. It's a way of blessing or hallowing or commemorating an event, both good and bad. It can be celebratory or it can be like a requiem, depending on the occasion. Just to give you an example, I also work mostly in contemporary theater, but there's a contemporary artist by the name of Okada Toshiki. He's world famous now. He works a lot in Germany. Last year he premiered, finally, during COVID, 2 No plays that he wrote in Yokohama. And the protagonists of these plays, the first play was called Zaha, and it was the ghost of Zaha Hadid, the Iraqi-born English architect who had designed the first version of the Olympic Stadium. And then it was rejected, and soon after she died. And so in this play, she comes back to haunt the new one. Kumakengo, I think, was the guy who was called in to sort of redesign it. And then the second one is the ghost of Japanese nuclear energy. It's called Tsuruga, and it's about the Monju reactor. And the music is all modern music, and the dance was modern dance. The guy who danced Zaha, Moriyama Mirai, is this kind of a contemporary neo-buto dancer, beautiful dancer. He also appeared and was in the opening ceremonies of the 2020 Olympic, where he was kind of dancing a commemorative dance to the spirits of the people who had died on March 11th in 2011. Yeah. So No is important as a kind of a liturgy, and when big things happen, we go back to ceremonial, to ritual, to try to give shape to our feelings, and No is a beautiful device for doing that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of supernatural aspects to No, and when I hear supernatural, one of the writers I think of is Izumi Kyoto. What is his relationship to No?
Kyoka was born in Kanazawa. His father was an artist and went to Damascene work. His mother came from a long line of No musicians and actors. His uncle, Matsumoto Kintaro, was a famous No actor of the Meiji period. And a number of his stories were inspired by No. One of his most famous is called Uta Andon, which is all a song for the lantern or something like that.
Yeah, it's the lantern.
Yeah.
Uta's song, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's all about the performance of a dance from the No play Ama, which is about a woman. She's a diver, right? That's what an Ama is. She's a diver who goes down into the depths of the sea to the Ryugu, the dragon palace, to seize this pearl and snatch it away. And the only way that she can do that is by cutting a opening in her breast and putting the pearl in there and concealing it. Otherwise, the fish and the dragon would try to get it back. And then she goes back and gives that to the prince or whatever. And it's a beautiful scene, and it's a beautiful dance. So the whole play is about No actors, and it's all about the performance of Ama at a particular moment. And I remember seeing a performance of Ama once, and it just brought me to tears because I thought about the original meaning of the play and juxtaposed with Izumi Kyoto doing it. Yeah.
So Izumi Kyoto hasn't actually written any No plays?
No, he worked in a kind of more sort of 19th, early 20th century melodramatic form, and then wrote a bunch of supernatural plays that are just kind of wild. They're just really crazy, like Yashagaike, Tenshu Monogatari. These plays, many which were not performed during his lifetime, were performed later on in the post-war period. Some are very anti-war and very anti-samurai and militarism. It was not until the 1960s, really, that people picked up on them. And then he became sort of a kind of a model for the counterculture of the 1960s. I mean, some of his stuff is totally wild. It's like a hallucination.
So maybe because of censorship, his plays didn't get a wider audience?
Partially, and just because they were so ahead of their time, they were so avant-garde that people didn't know what to do with them, you know.
So I was wondering if you could tell me about the Saigo plays, and especially Saigo Zakura. He's such a great and well-known poet.
Yeah. So in Kyoto, located to the sort of the west of town, near Oharano, is a place called Hananotera, Sojiji. It's a very country temple, and there is a cherry tree there. And it's called the Saigo Zakura, Saigo's cherry tree. And in the play, Saigo goes to this temple to get away from the crowds at cherry viewing time. And he wants to have a quiet, peaceful time. And he's sort of grumbling about how all of these people partying spoil nature. And lo and behold, the cherry tree comes to life, or it's already with Git's voice, and says, Saigo, you know, you're being a party pooper. All of these people are partying because of people like me, you know, that are blossoming right now. It's because we're so beautiful, and that makes everybody feel light and want to have a fun time. And really, Saigo, you need to sort of lighten up. It's a lovely play that way, and it's indicative of a lot of other Japanese plays where the natural world, to some extent, animals, but usually nice animals like cranes and things like that. But to a larger extent, flowers and trees will come to life and speak back to the human world and berate them. Usually the trope is that, you know, there's an expression in Japanese, somoku jobutsu, that even the grasses and trees become Buddhas. They are capable of enlightenment. And so the trope in these plays is that the human beings are supposed to be sentient, but they're not as sentient as insentient life. So that's what's going on there.
So we've talked about lots of plays, and what would you recommend people could read to start to learn more about No and other Japanese plays?
One book I would point them to as a great reference work came out in 2016 from Cambridge University Press, and it's called A History of Japanese Theatre. And it's from the earliest stuff to contemporary times. And it's written by a whole team of scholars, both foreign and Japanese, on all sorts of different aspects of Japanese theater. All of the different genres from earliest times to contemporary, different styles, different aspects of staging, music, so on and so forth. So that's a great place to go to learn a little bit more about all of these genres. Actually, another book is Traditional Japanese Theater, an Anthology of Plays by Karen Brazel and Monica Beth. That's from Columbia. And again, it's got a range of essentially the major genres of traditional Japanese theater: No, Kyogen, bunraku puppet plays, and kabuki. And then for No, there's Royal Tyler's Japanese No dramas from Penguin. Tyler is one of the great translators of classical Japanese literature. He's translated The Tale of Genji, The Tale of the Heike, and many other works, and has a self-published book. It was probably published around 2013, but it's possibly coming out again, of more translations of No plays. For Kabuki, the best series is edited by James Brandon and Samuel Leiter. It's called Kabuki Plays on Stage, 4 volumes, from University of Hawaii Press. puppet theater as well. On Bunraku, for example, Donald Keene was a great introducer of Japanese literature, both traditional and modern, in the post-war period. And he was a great supporter of performing arts. And Andrew Gerstle, Barbara Adachi's Backstage at the Bunraku is a classic. For modern theater, one of the anthologies that I was editor of is the Columbia Anthology of Modern Japanese Drama with Tom Reimer and Mitsuya Mori. It's a big fat book, about 700 pages long, and it's got some good essays in there and lots of plays. There's lots more, but those would be good places to start.
And you've done a lot of translation work as well, haven't you?
Yes.
And I read recently in the Oxford Book of Japanese Short Stories, which is edited by Theodore Gusen, who's one of the translators of Murakami.
Yes.
I saw your story.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that story?
It's Okamoto Kanoko's story about an older woman who was a geisha and her relationship with a young man that obviously she's kind of interested in romantically, although he's completely oblivious to that fact. Okamoto Kanoko was an interesting person. She was both a poet and a novelist, and she was also a very assiduous student of Buddhism. She wrote texts on Buddhist philosophy and so on and so forth. Yes, Portrait of an Old Geisha is what it's called. Yeah, so I've done some translation. I've translated some couple of Kyoka stories, but more Kyoka plays. Mostly I've done some kabuki in that series by Brandon and Leiter. I've got 3 kabuki plays in there, including Sagi Musume. Do you know this story about the Heron Maiden? It's a dance play. It's beautiful.
Anything with a heron in it sounds beautiful to me.
Yeah, yes. We have herons around.
Everywhere.
And then a lot of more contemporary plays. Betsuyaku Minoru's kind of Japan's Samuel Beckett, Karajuro, very crazy, wild playwright. More contemporary, Hirato Oriza. I've got a book by him of 6 plays. And then Okada Toshiki, the guy I mentioned who's been writing contemporary no plays. Yeah.
Well, that certainly gives people a lot of places they can delve into Japan's performing arts. Thank you so much for that, and thanks for coming on to the Books on Asia podcast.
Thank you, Amy. It was such a pleasure to be here, and really be here, be on Shiraishi Island.
It's great. So nice of you to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. Of particular interest to those listeners for this episode, please check out the Stonebridge book Yamamba, In Search of the Japanese Mountain Witch, edited by Rebecca Copeland and Linda Ehrlich. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.